In this video, we're gonna look at smell pathways. Mainly, we're gonna start out from the olfactory mucosa and then to olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, olfactory stria, and then we're gonna end up with the olfactory cortex. But before moving on, let's see what the taste and smell are. Well, in the peripheral nervous system, there are sensory or afferent neurons and the motor or efferent neurons. We are focusing on the sensory neurons in this video. So mainly in the body, there are general somatic afferents, which are touch, pain, pressure, vibration, temperature, and proprioception that are received in skin, body wall, and limbs. And there are also special somatic sensory sensations, which include hearing, the audition, equilibrium, the balance, and the vision. And there are also sensations that we get from our internal organs. That is called the general visceral sensory, which include spasm, stretch, pain, temperature, chemical changes, changes in pressure of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and both the concentration and the pressure of the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body, irritation in viscera, nausea, hunger, fullness, which are all general visceral sensations. We have also special visceral sensations, which are taste and smell. Today, we're gonna talk about taste and smell. Now, when we compare general and special senses, we see that general senses are scattered throughout the body. It means we receive pain or tactile stimuli or pressure, vibration from any part of our body. But the special senses are concentrated in specific locations, particularly in the head. And general senses are carried by all spinal and cranial nerves if they have sensory nerve fibers, but the special senses are limited to the cranial nerves, which have sensory nerve fibers. General senses are detected and carried by simple structures, but for the special senses, there are anatomically distinct structures which have a very complex neural pathway. Yes, we divide the general senses in the general somatic sensations and the general visceral sensations. And the special senses include smell, taste, vision, hearing, and the equilibrium. Now, when we look at the functions of the smell, it is more important in animals than the humans. Humans are not very much dependent on the smell to find their way, to hunt their prey, or to make adjustment, to make plan. So smell is more important in animals than humans. So smell serves as gatekeepers. If something is good, take it in. Smells bad, just reject it. And smell also helps animal to orient in space, also helps animal to mark its territory, guides animal to find other animals, guides also animals to find food, and also helps animal to detect if the animal in estrus or not. But smell is also, to some degree, is important for humans as well. We detect spoiled food through smelling. If it smells bad, we just reject it. If it smells good, then there is a good possibility for that food to be good and healthy. But that's not the case all the time. We can smell fire, and perfumes also are shown to be important in human life. If person cannot smell, then it's called the anosmia. Smelling is also a part of the taste sensation. The better we smell, the better taste we can get from the food we take in. Okay, so smell allows us to separate undesirable or lethal foods from those that are nutritious. Smell also helps us to recognize the proximity or other individuals or animals, and it is tied to the primitive emotional and behavioral functions of the nervous system. Now let's look at the features of the smell in animals and human. In animals, there are many more olfactory receptors than the humans. For example, bloodhounds can pick up a 24-hour-old trail, and dogs have around 1 trillion olfactory receptors, and we have about 10 million to 100 million olfactory cells. So animals have greater number of receptors, thus better sense of smell. Usually, their ability to detect and smell is around 10 times greater than human. We can smell happiness and fear. Well, everyone has an unique smell except identical twins. They are shown to have identical smell patterns. Sniffer rods have been used to detect explosives. Okay, now let's look at the olfactory mucosa. Olfactory mucosa in the nasal cavity. But overall, the smell is least understood of all senses and poorly developed in humans. In the nasal cavity, there is an olfactory region. Olfactory region, or the olfactory mucosa, covers the upper half of the middle nasal congi, entire of the superior nasal congi, and corresponding part of the roof of the nasal cavity, and also corresponding part of the nasal septum contain olfactory membrane. And olfactory membrane contains olfactory cells. Look at, these are the olfactory cells. Olfactory cells, or the olfactory receptor. And olfactory cells, as you see here, contain odorant binding proteins. Odorant binding proteins at the cilia of the receptor. These are the cilia. the cilia contain odorant binding proteins. That's how the receptor of the hair, the cilia of the photoreceptors can bind the odor molecules. And the olfactory receptors are actual bipolar neurons. Look at, they have two projections for extending from their cell body. So in the body, olfactory receptors are the actual bipolar neurons. And in contrast to other neurons, these olfactory receptors can regenerate every around 30 to 45 days. Now let's look at this olfactory mucosa in detail, or the olfactory epithelium. Inside the olfactory epithelium, there are receptor cell with cilia, and there are supporting cells. These are the supporting cells, and there are basal cells. So there are three main cells in olfactory epithelium. But can we smell everything? Well, not really. To smell a substance, an odor substance, the substance must be volatile so that it can be sniffed into the nostrils, and the substance must be at least slightly water soluble to penetrate the mucus to reach the olfactory cells. Moreover, the substance must be at least slightly lipid soluble to interact with the olfactory membrane, or the membrane of the cells, neurons. And the olfactory receptors adapt very slowly, but the olfactory sensation itself adapts rather rapidly. And this smell must involve a central mechanism. Now, the olfactory pathways have no synapse in the thalamus for arriving information. We know that all the other sensory pathways pass through the thalamus, but the olfactory pathways do not synapse or pass through the thalamus. And we have ability to discriminate different smells. So we can, especially animals, can distinguish thousands of chemical stimuli. And the central nervous system interprets smells by pattern of receptor activity. And the olfactory receptor population, or the olfactory neurons, show considerable turnover. But the number of receptors declines as we get older. Primary sensory of smells are camphoraceous, musky, floral, peppermint, ethereal, pungent, and putrid smells. So these are the primary sensations of the smell that we can detect. The odor molecules inside the inhaled air is transmitted in the air through the nostrils into the nasal cavity. And the odor molecules arriving the olfactory mucosa stimulate the olfactory neurons. Okay, here is the olfactory mucosa. So we're gonna take a small piece from this area and magnify it to see what we have in this region of the body relating to olfaction. Now here there is the serous secretion with mucus produced by this olfactory gland, olfactory gland. There are olfactory receptors. We see here a developing olfactory receptor. These are the supporting cells, and up here we have basal cells, and these neurons, olfactory receptors, are real bipolar cells. Their peripheral processes extend into the olfactory mucosa, especially through their olfactory hair. So the odorant molecule can interact with the olfactory hair of the olfactory receptor. Okay, look at here. So in olfactory epithelium, there are around 10 to 100 million olfactory receptors. And as you see here, olfactory receptors are real bipolar neurons with cilia called olfactory hairs. These olfactory receptors respond to chemical stimuli of an odorant molecule. There are also supporting cells in the olfactory epithelium. These supporting cells provide support and nourishment to the olfactory receptor. There are also basal cells. These are the basal cells. Basal cells replace olfactory receptors as they die out. Okay, here is again the olfactory receptor cell. Their peripheral processes terminate in the mucus covering the olfactory region, and their central processes, their axons, come together and form the filaments of the olfactory nerve. Look at, here are the filaments of the olfactory nerve. Filaments of the olfactory nerve pass through the holes in the cribriform or the foraminae in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then they synapse with the dendrites of the mitral cells in the olfactory bulb. This is the olfactory bulb. And these are the mitral cells, which are the output cells inside the olfactory bulb. And the axons of the mitral cells form the olfactory tract. Here we see the olfactory gland. Its secretion is important. So the secretion of the olfactory glands is mucus and moisturize the olfactory mucosa over the olfactory region in the nasal cavity. Okay, so the specialized neurons present in the olfactory epithelium in the nose, and they project cilia in the mucus layer. The cilia are able to bind odorant molecules. the binding triggers action potential, which is transmitted to the olfactory area of the olfactory bulb right here. Then the olfactory tract, then olfactory stria, then into the olfactory cortex. Each olfactory receptor is specialized for one odorant molecule. Here we see the olfactory cortex. Here is the olfactory cortex. The uncus houses the olfactory cortex, which includes preformed cortex, the posterior orbitofrontal cortex, amygdala, olfactory tubercle, and the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, here is the olfactory cortex and the gustatory cortex. As you see, the gustatory and the olfactory cortices are located very close each other. Here is the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, then the medial and lateral olfactory stria. Here is the lateral olfactory stria. This is the preformed cortex, the primary olfactory area. And the orbitofrontal cortex under the frontal lobe is the secondary olfactory area. Now, let's look at the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, and olfactory stria in details here. Now, in the olfactory mucosa, there are olfactory cells. They are real bipolar neurons. Their axons come together and form the filaments of the olfactory nerve. They pass through the foraminae in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and some of them synapse, as you see here, some of them synapse with the dendrites of the tufted cells, and also with the dendrites of the periglomerulus cells, and they form what's called glomerulus. These are the mitral cells, which also synapses with cranial cell, and the axons of the mitral cells form the olfactory tract. But the fibers inside the optic tract, some of them may travel to the other contralateral olfactory bulb through this medial olfactory stria. And similarly, some afferent fibers might come from the contralateral olfactory bulb to the opposite olfactory tract. And what you see here, the olfactory nerve fibers indicated in red coming from the contralateral olfactory tract through the anterior commissura. What you see here, shown in blue, are the olfactory nerve fibers going to the contralateral olfactory bulb. Now, the olfactory tract divides into a lateral olfactory tract and medial, I'm sorry. So in front of the anterior perforated substance, olfactory tract divides into a lateral olfactory stria and into a medial olfactory stria, and also a intermediate olfactory stria, but this is mostly known as the olfactory tubercle. It is the olfactory tubercle. And the lateral olfactory stria terminates in preformed cortex and the amygdaloid body. Now, the orbitofrontal cortex is a prefrontal cortex region in frontal lobes in the brain, which is involved in the cognitive processing of decision making. And in addition, orbitofrontal cortex is involved in critical human functions such as social adjustment and the control of mood, drive, and responsibility. Traits are crucial in defining the personality of an individual. And this orbitofrontal cortex is the Brodmann's area 10, 11, and the 47. Here we see the orbitofrontal cortex that is important in social adjustment, control of mood, drive, and responsibility. Okay, here is the orbitofrontal cortex. Ventral lateral prefrontal cortex, dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. Here is the central sulcus. Just in front of the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus, that is the primary motor cortex. Right behind the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus, which contains the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, orbitofrontal cortex here is important to make decision, to evaluate incoming stimuli, and to achieve and evaluate the values, goals, emotional state, and the social situation. If this orbitofrontal cortex is damaged, the damage impairs the ability of the body or the brain to make decisions that require feedback from social or emotional cues. Now, orbitofrontal cortex is a multi-modal convergence site in the brain. So the visual information about the taste, they pass through the thalamus and then terminate in the primary taste cortex. Olfaction is processed through olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, olfactory stria into the primary olfactory cortex. And touch is also processed through different ascending pathways to the thalamus and then to the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex. But finally, the information regarding vision, taste, olfaction, and touch, they are all converged in the orbitofrontal cortex. So orbitofrontal cortex is a multi-modal convergence site in the brain. Okay, here is the olfactory mucosa, where there are the olfactory receptors which detect the odor molecules, and then the signals are processed inside the olfactory bulb, and the axons of the mitral cells form the olfactory tract, which then divide in the medial and lateral olfactory stria and terminate in preformed cortex for conscious discrimination, and in amygdala in the amygdala for the emotional responses. But finally, they synapse in the thalamus and then finally end up in orbitofrontal cortex for sophisticated evaluation of the olfaction. For the olfactory mucosa contains the olfactory receptors. So the olfactory information can lead the emotional response. This emotional response is carried from olfactory bulb through the lateral olfactory stria to amygdala, then thalamus to the orbitofrontal cortex. And for the conscious discrimination of the smell, the olfactory related signals are transmitted through the olfactory bulb, then to the preformed cortex, the thalamus, and then this neural pathways determine emotional responses and conscious discrimination. Okay, so the olfactory receptor neurons detect the odor molecule or the smell and is conveyed through the olfactory bulb. So the olfactory information terminating or arriving to frontal cortex is for conscious perception of smell. Those olfactory information going to the hypothalamus and amygdala is important for motivational and emotional aspects of smell, and the olfactory information going to the hippocampus is important for odor memory. We have odor memory, so we can match odor with time, with object, with events that we experienced in the past. Okay, look at here. There is a strong association between smell and the memory. So the smell can bring on a flood of memories, influences moods, even affect their work performance. Because the olfactory bulb is part of the brain's limbic system, and smell can call up memories and powerful responses almost instantaneously. When we first smell a new scent, we link it to an event, a person, a thing, or even a moment. So when we smell or take same scent later on in our life, our brain forges a link between the smell and a memory. So the associating smell of chlorine with summers at the pool or lilies with a funeral. For example, a smell of chlorine might remind us a wonderful summer holiday, maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years back in our life, and the friends that we had during that particular holiday. Or the lilies can remind us a funeral of our beloved died maybe 10, 15, or 20 years ago. So there is a strong connection between the smell and the memory. So the smell can trigger memories. And when we encounter a smell again, the link is already in amygdala and ready to elicit a memory or a mood. So again, the chlorine might call up a specific pool-related memory or simply make you feel or us content. And lilies might agitate us without knowing why. This is part of the reason why not everyone likes the same smells, because the same smell might remind each of us a different story. Because we encounter most new odors in our youth, smells often call up childhood memories. But we actually begin making associations between smell and emotion before we are born. So the infants who were exposed to alcohol or the cigarette smoke or garlic in the embryonic life show a preference for the same smells. To them, the smells that might upset other babies seem normal or even comforting. Okay, so we're gonna continue to taste pathways in other video.